Good evening, friends, and welcome to tonight's journey through the fascinating world of Tudor dining. As you settle into your bed, perhaps pulling that soft blanket a little closer around your shoulders, I invite you to dim your lights and we'll wander through the kitchens and dining halls of Tudor England, where the nobility turned every meal into a statement of power and wealth. Picture yourself as a gentle observer, invisible and weightless, floating through these grand halls where the air itself seems thick with the aromas of exotic spices and the crackle of roasting fires. If this calm journey helps you unwind tonight, feel free to tap like and subscribe, but only if it feels right to you in this moment. Let me tell you about a world where a simple dinner could feature 20 different dishes, where peacocks were served wearing their own iridescent feathers, and where sugar sculptures graced tables like edible art installations. As the night settles around us and your breathing grows deeper and more relaxed, we'll explore 6 delightful chapters of Tudor culinary history together. Close your eyes now, and let me transport you to a warm Tudor kitchen where the most enchanting sweet creations are taking shape. The year is 1540, and you're watching skilled confectioners work their magic with ingredients that would have been worth their weight in silver. Can you hear the gentle grinding of almonds in a marble mortar, the soft whisper of sugar being sifted through fine silk cloth? This is where marchpane, what we know today as marzipan, was transformed from simple ingredients into edible dreams. Imagine the texture of those perfectly ground almonds between your fingers, as fine as powdered silk. The Tudor confectioners would spend hours achieving just the right consistency, mixing their precious almonds with sugar that had traveled all the way from Cyprus. The resulting paste had a delicate, almost ethereal quality, nutty and sweet, but not cloying like modern confections. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of Play-Doh, but infinitely more delicious and far more valuable. The magic truly began when this marchpane was shaped into what the Tudors called subtleties, edible sculptures that served as both dessert and entertainment. Picture yourself watching a master confectioner carefully molding a miniature castle, complete with tiny turrets and delicate battlements. Their fingers work slowly, methodically, as if they're crafting something sacred rather than edible. The concentration on their face reminds you of a watchmaker or a jeweler. And in many ways, that's exactly what they were, artists, working in the medium of sweetness. These subtleties weren't just random shapes thrown together to impress guests. Oh no, they told stories, conveyed messages, and sometimes even delivered subtle political commentary. A subtlety shaped like a heart that's a male deer might honor a visiting lord whose family crest featured the same animal. A delicate sugar rose could celebrate a wedding or acknowledge a lady's beauty. The most ambitious confectioners would create entire zodiacal scenes, complete with all 12 signs carefully rendered in sweet, edible detail. Can you imagine the gasps of delight when servants carried these confections into the great hall? The candlelight would catch the subtle sheen of the marchpane, making it glow like ivory or polished bone. Some subtleties were gilded with actual gold leafius, real gold that was safe to eat, creating an effect that must have seemed almost magical in the flickering light of hundreds of candles. The contrast between the warm golden glow and the pale would have been absolutely breathtaking. But let's not forget the other sweet delights that graced Tudor tables. While you rest there, breathing slowly and deeply, Picture yourself wandering through a kitchen where elderflower fritters are being prepared. The cook has gathered fresh elderflower blossoms that morning when the dew was still clinging to their delicate petals. These flowers, with their intoxicating honey-like fragrance, are dipped into a batter made from wholemeal flour and then gently fried in butter over the glowing coals. The sound of these fritters cooking is like a gentle whisper, soft bubbling of butter, the occasional satisfied sigh from the cook as she turns each delicate morsel. The resulting treats are like eating spring itself, crispy on the outside, tender within, with the floral essence of elderflower brightening every bite. Imagine how revolutionary this must have seemed, turning flowers into food, bringing the garden directly to the table in the most literal way possible. Sweet pies were another Tudor favorite, though they were quite different from what we might expect today. These weren't necessarily filled with fruit, as we might imagine. Instead, Tudor cooks would create pastries filled with mixtures of dried fruits, nuts, and honey, all encased in delicate pastry and then fried in butter. The result was something like a medieval donut, but infinitely more sophisticated. Picture the golden exterior giving way to a sweet, complex filling that combined the concentrated sweetness of dried fruits with the rich earthiness of nuts and the floral notes of honey. These fried sweet treats served an important, practical purpose beyond just tasting delicious. In an age before reliable refrigeration, frying in fat helped preserve foods, extending their shelf life and making them safer to eat. The Tudor kitchen was nothing if not practical, even when creating the most fanciful delicacies. Every technique, every ingredient choice, had a reason rooted in centuries of accumulated wisdom about food safety and preservation. The wealthy Tudor household would also indulge in what they called comfits, seeds, or nuts, coated in multiple layers of hard sugar syrup. Making comfits was an art form that required incredible patience and skill. Picture a confectioner slowly rotating a handful of caraway seeds in a shallow pan while drizzling them with sugar syrup. Layer after layer would be applied, each one dried completely before the next was added. The process could take hours or even days, resulting in small, precious jewels of sweetness that would dissolve slowly on the tongue, releasing their flavors in waves. Wafers were another delightful sweet, thin and delicate, like communion hosts, but flavored with rosewater or other precious essences. These were considered so refined that they were reserved for the highest tables at court. Imagine the skill required to roll the batter, paper thin, cook it to the perfect golden color, and then serve it while still warm and crisp. Each wafer was like edible parchment, dissolving instantly when it touched the tongue and leaving behind only the ghost of sweetness and floral notes. Let's pause for a moment and consider what sugar meant in Tudor times. Today, we take sweetness for granted. We can buy pounds of sugar for the cost of a coffee. But in the 16th century, sugar was a luxury import from Cyprus and other distant Mediterranean islands. It was stored in special locked boxes, measured out carefully like medicine, and used sparingly, even in the wealthiest households. When you bit into a Tudor sweet, you were literally tasting wealth and international trade connections. The preparation of these sweets was often a communal activity. In large households, picture the scene: several kitchen maids working together to grind almonds for marchpane. their wooden pestles keeping time like a gentle percussion ensemble. The head confectioner would oversee the work, tasting and adjusting, adding a pinch more sugar here or a drop of rose water there. The kitchen would be warm and fragrant, filled with the sounds of quiet conversation and the rhythmic work of preparation. Rosewater deserves special mention here, as it was the vanilla extract of the Tudor world, made by distilling rose petals. It added a sophisticated floral note to countless confections. Close your eyes and imagine the process. Fresh rose petals, gathered at dawn when their fragrance was strongest, slowly heated with water in a special still. The resulting liquid captured the very essence of the flower, concentrated into just a few precious drops. When added to marchpane or wafers, it transformed simple sweets into something that seemed to carry the perfume of an entire garden. The timing of sweet service was crucial in Tudor dining. These delicacies weren't scattered throughout the meal as appetizers or side dishes. Instead, they formed what was called the void, the third and final course of formal dinners, served standing in a separate room while guests sipped spiced wine called hypocrite. Picture this elegant procession, well-dressed diners moving from the great hall to a smaller, more intimate chamber, where tables were laid with the most precious sweets the household could afford. As we drift toward the end of this sweet chapter, let your mind rest on the image of a Tudor confectioner putting the finishing touches on an elaborate subtlety. Perhaps it's a swan, crafted to honor a special guest. Its long neck curved gracefully, and its feathers suggested by delicate scoring in the marchpane surface. The confectioner steps back, wipes their hands on their apron, and smiles with satisfaction. Tomorrow, this creation will delight and amaze the lord of the manor and his guests. But tonight, in the quiet kitchen, lit only by dying embers, it represents hours of patient, skilled work. Art that happens to be edible. The sweet treats of Tudor nobility weren't just food. They were edible expressions of wealth, artistry, and hospitality. Each marchpane subtlety, each delicate wafer, each perfectly crafted comfit represented a connection. Two distant lands, skilled craftspeople, and centuries of culinary tradition. As you settle deeper into your pillow tonight, imagine the satisfaction of those Tudor confectioners, knowing they had created not just sustenance, but wonder itself, one sweet bite at a time. And now, as your breathing grows even more relaxed, and your mind drifts further from the concerns of the day, let me guide you into the fascinating world of Tudor meat cookery. Here, in the smoky warmth of great kitchens with their enormous hearths, we'll discover some of the most extraordinary dishes ever served to English nobility foods. So unusual, they might make you chuckle into your pillow. Picture yourself standing in the great kitchen of Hampton Court Palace on a typical feast day in 1530. The air is thick with smoke and incredible aromas, and before you stretches a scene that would challenge even the most adventurous modern foodie. 6 enormous fires burn constantly, each tended by its own team of spitboys, whose job it is to turn massive joints of meat hour after hour. But these aren't just ordinary beef roasts or pork shoulders. Oh, no. The Tudor nobility had far more exotic tastes than that. Let's begin with perhaps the most surprising item on the Tudor menu: beaver tails. Yes, you heard that correctly. Beaver tails, grilled to perfection and served with great ceremony. Now, Before you wrinkle your nose in disgust, let me explain the wonderfully twisted logic behind this delicacy. You see, medieval Christians were forbidden from eating meat on Fridays, but some clever theological reasoning had classified beavers as fish because they lived in water and had scaly tails. This convenient loophole allowed the wealthy to enjoy what was considered a delicacy while still observing religious requirements. Imagine the skill required to prepare beaver tail properly. The cook would first need to skin the tail carefully, revealing the pale, fatty meat beneath. Then it would be grilled over carefully. Controlled coals, the fat rendering slowly and creating a rich, smoky flavor that was apparently quite popular among the Tudor elite. The taste was described as similar to pork, but richer, with a slightly fishy undertone that reminded diners of its aquatic origins. Picture yourself as a dinner guest, watching with bemused fascination as this unusual dish was served with great solemnity. Everyone pretending it was perfectly normal to eat what was essentially a large, flat-tailed rodent. But beaver tails were just the beginning of Tudor culinary adventurousness. Even more surprising was the regular appearance of whale meat on noble tables. In an age when whaling was a legitimate and profitable enterprise, whale meat was fairly common and relatively cheap. https://recipes.hows.at-of-henry-vi-htm. Compared to other luxury foods, the meat was typically served either very well roasted to render out the oil and concentrate. The flavors. Close your eyes and try to imagine the logistics of preparing whale meat in a Tudor kitchen. First, enormous chunks of the meat would arrive at the kitchen, probably wrapped in sailcloth and smelling distinctly of the sea. The cooks would have to decide whether to boil it in the great copper kettles or roast it on specially reinforced spits. Either way, the cooking process would take many hours, filling the kitchen with aromas that were probably an acquired taste. The finished dish was described as rich and oily, with a flavor that was unmistakably marine, but hearty enough to satisfy the enormous appetites of Tudor nobles, like beaver tails. Whale meat was conveniently classified as appropriate for fast days, since whales were considered fish rather than meat. This allowed pious nobles to indulge in exotic protein while still maintaining their religious observances. There's something delightfully practical about this approach. Why let religious restrictions interfere with your enjoyment of expensive imported delicacies? Now, let's turn our attention to what might be the most theatrical dish in the entire Tudor repertoire: whole roasted peacock, served in full plumage. Picture this spectacular presentation. The bird would first be carefully skinned, keeping the magnificent feathers intact. The meat would then be roasted on a spit until perfectly done, seasoned with expensive spices and basted with rich drippings. But here's where the real artistry came in. Once cooked, the peacock would be redressed in its own iridescent feathers, arranged so carefully that it appeared to be a living bird that just happened to be lying on a golden platter. But wait, there's more. The peacock's beak would be carefully gilded with actual gold leaf, creating a shimmering accent that caught the candlelight beautifully. Sometimes, the bird's tail feathers would be fanned out in their full glory, creating a display that was part dinner, part art installation. Imagine the gasps of admiration when this creation was carried into the great hall, the servers walking slowly and carefully to avoid disturbing the elaborate plumage arrangement. The taste of peacock was reportedly similar to turkey, but slightly gamier, with meat that was both tender and flavorful when properly prepared. But let's be honest, nobody was really ordering peacock for the taste. This was pure theatrical dining, a way to demonstrate not just wealth, but also access to exotic birds and skilled kitchen staff capable of this kind of elaborate presentation. It was the Tudor equivalent of serving a dish that's been featured on Instagram. Except the photography was three-dimensional and edible. Swans received similar treatment. And here's where things get really interesting from a legal perspective. Even today, all mute swans in England are owned by the Crown and cannot be eaten without royal permission. In Tudor times, this made swan an incredibly exclusive dish, available only to those with direct connections to the monarchy. A roasted swan would often be presented with a gold crown upon its head, driving home the point that this was truly food fit for royalty. The preparation of swan was similar to peacock careful skinning to preserve the pristine white feathers, expert roasting to ensure the meat remained tender, and then elaborate presentation that emphasized the bird's natural beauty. The meat was described as rich and slightly gamey, with a flavor more pronounced than goose, but less intense than venison. But again, the real value was in the exclusivity and the dramatic presentation. Let's pause here and consider the sheer audacity of these presentations. In an age without electric lighting, imagine how these feathered creations would have looked by candlelight. The peacock's iridescent plumage would have shimmered and shifted with every flicker of flame, while the swan's pure white feathers would have glowed like moonlight against the dark wood of the dining table. These weren't just meals, they were theatrical productions designed to create lasting memories and demonstrate the host's sophistication and resources. But perhaps even more adventurous than these, elaborate bird presentations were the organ meats that regularly appeared on Tudor tables. Modern diners might turn up their noses at the thought, but Tudor cooks believed in using every part of an animal, and organ meats were often considered the greatest delicacies. Picture yourself watching a cook prepare beef lungs, cleaning them carefully, and then stuffing them with a mixture of breadcrumbs, herbs, and spices before roasting them until golden. Beef spleen was another prized organ meat, typically sliced thin and grilled quickly over high heat to preserve its tender texture. And then there were beef udders, which were considered an absolute delicacy when properly prepared. These would be cleaned, blanched, and then roasted with rich seasonings until they achieved a texture that was reportedly similar to sweetbreads, but with a more pronounced flavor. The preparation of organ meats required considerable skill and knowledge. Unlike muscle meat, organs had to be prepared quickly after slaughter and cooked with precision to avoid tough, unpleasant textures. The best cooks developed techniques for preserving organ meats in brine or vinegar, extending their usability and concentrating their flavors. These preserved organs would then be incorporated into complex dishes that showcased the cook's expertise and the household's commitment to using every valuable part of their expensive livestock. Blood sausage, or black pudding, as the Tudors called it, was another regular feature of noble tables. This involved filling lengths of pig intestine with the animal's boiled, congealed blood mixed with fat, oatmeal, and spices. The resulting sausages would be boiled until firm and then sliced and fried for service. The taste was rich and intensely savory, with a smooth texture that was unlike anything else on the medieval menu. Making black pudding was considered something of an art form. The blood had to be collected fresh and used quickly before it coagulated naturally. The mixture of blood, fat, and grain required careful balancing to achieve the right texture. Too much blood and the sausage would be too soft, too little, and it would be dry and crumbly. Experienced cooks developed their own secret recipes, adding herbs and spices that complemented the rich, iron-heavy flavor of the blood. One of the most spectacular presentations was the boar's head, which served as the centerpiece of Christmas feasts. Picture an enormous boar's head, expertly roasted and then garnished with bay leaves and sprigs of rosemary. The tusks would be polished until they gleamed, and sometimes the entire head would be glazed with a mixture of honey and spices that created a magnificent golden finish. The head would be carried into the hall on a massive platter, often accompanied by musicians and great ceremony. The tradition of the boar's head was deeply rooted in English custom and represented abundance, strength, and the successful hunt. Preparing such a massive piece required days of work. First, the careful butchering to remove the head intact, then the complex process of cooking something so large evenly. Special roasting techniques had to be developed to ensure that the outside didn't burn while the interior cooked through completely. As you lie there, feeling more and more relaxed, imagine the satisfaction of a Tudor cook who had successfully prepared one of these challenging dishes. The peacock gleaming in its restored plumage, the boar's head glistening with its honey glaze, the whale meat tender and perfectly seasoned, each represented hours of skilled work and intimate knowledge of ingredients that most people today have never encountered. These exotic meats weren't just about showing off, though that was certainly part of their appeal. They also represented a connection to the wider world, a time when trade routes brought unusual foods from distant places, and when the English nobility prided themselves on their sophisticated international palates. Every bite of whale meat connected the diner to the dangerous work of whalers in northern seas, just as every slice of peacock represented the exotic bird markets of continental Europe. And now, as this chapter of unusual meats draws to a close, let your mind rest on the image of a Tudor kitchen after a great feast. The fires are burning low, the spits have stopped turning, and the kitchen staff are finally sitting down to their own meal, probably much simpler fare, but satisfying after a day of creating culinary theater for their betters. The exotic aromas still linger in the air, the rich gaminess of roasted swan, the marine scent of whale meat, the smoky richness of black pudding. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new opportunities to transform unusual ingredients into memorable dining experiences. But tonight, in the quiet kitchen, there's a sense of work well done and wonders successfully created. As we continue our gentle journey through Tudor kitchens, feeling more relaxed with each breath, let me lead you into a world where the very act of seasoning food was an expression of wealth and worldliness. Picture yourself in a Tudor spice room, one of the most secure and valuable chambers in any great house. The The air here is intoxicating thick with the mingled aromas of cinnamon and nutmeg, the sharp bite of black pepper, the exotic sweetness of cardamom pods. These small, unassuming rooms held treasures worth more than gold, and the keys to them were guarded as jealously as any jewelry box. Close your eyes and imagine running your fingers through a bowl of perfect peppercorns, each one worth its weight in silver. In our modern world, we sprinkle black pepper on our eggs without a second thought. But in Tudor England, pepper was so valuable, it was sometimes used as currency. Ships sailed halfway around the world to bring these small, wrinkled treasures to English ports, where they would be carefully measured, tested for quality, and sold to only the wealthiest households. The spices that graced Tudor tables came from China, Africa, and India. https://www.hrp.org.uk/hampton-court-and-stories/tudor-food-and-eating/ places so distant they might as well have been on the moon. Imagine the journey of a single cinnamon stick, cut from a tree in Ceylon, dried under tropical sun, bundled with hundreds of others, loaded onto ships that would face storms, pirates, and navigational challenges that could add months to their voyage. By the time that cinnamon stick reached an English kitchen, it had literally traveled around the world and survived adventures that would make for epic stories. Nutmeg was even more precious, coming exclusively from a few tiny islands in what is now Indonesia. Picture yourself holding one of these small brown seeds, knowing that it represents the culmination of a trade network, spanning thousands of miles and involving dozens of intermediaries. The warm, sweet fragrance that emerges when you grate fresh nutmeg would have seemed almost magical to Tudor diners here, was the captured essence of distant tropical islands, concentrated into something small enough to hold in your palm. But spices weren't just about flavor. They were medicine, status symbols, and preservation aids, all rolled into one. Medieval medical theory held that different spices could balance the body's humors, promoting health and preventing disease. A pinch of ginger wasn't just seasoning. It was believed to warm the stomach and aid digestion. Cinnamon was thought to strengthen the heart, while cloves could freshen breath and prevent tooth decay. Imagine the care with which a Tudor cook would select spices for a dish, considering not just how they would taste together, but how they might benefit the health of whoever consumed them. The preparation and storage of spices required specialized knowledge and equipment. Picture a spice merchant's shop with its carefully organized drawers and containers, each labeled in several languages to accommodate the international nature of the trade. Whole spices kept better than ground ones, so most households purchased them whole and ground them fresh as needed. The sound of a mortar and pestle grinding cinnamon bark or crushing cardamom pods would have been a regular feature of busy Tudor kitchens. Let's turn our attention now to another category of exotic imports, the Mediterranean treasures that began appearing on English tables during the Tudor period. Citrus fruits, almonds, and olive oil might seem commonplace to us, but in 16th century England, they were exotic luxuries that spoke of sophisticated continental connections and considerable wealth. Imagine the first time an English nobleman bit into a fresh orange. The explosion of sweet tart juice, the intense citrus fragrance, the sunny brightness of flavoured must have been a revelation. Oranges came from Spain and Italy, packed carefully in sawdust or wrapped individually in cloth to protect them. During the long journey north, many arrived partially spoiled or dried out, making perfect specimens all the more valuable and prized. Lemons were even more exotic and were primarily valued for their medicinal properties rather than their culinary applications. Picture a Tudor physician carefully prescribing lemon juice to treat scurvy or recommending lemon water to aid digestion. The sharp, cleansing taste would have been unlike anything in the traditional English diet, which relied heavily on mild flavors and simple seasonings. Almonds opened up entirely new possibilities for Tudor cooks. These nuts, imported primarily from Spain and Italy, could be ground into flour for delicate cakes, blanched and slivered for garnishes, or processed into the almond milk that was essential for cooking during Lent. Picture yourself watching a cook carefully blanching almonds, slipping off their brown skins to reveal the pure white nuts beneath. These would then be ground by hand in marble mortar until they formed a smooth paste that could be mixed with rosewater and sugar to create the marchpane we explored in our first chapter. Olive oil was perhaps the most foreign of all these Mediterranean imports. English cooking had always relied on animal fats, lard, butter, and beef dripping, so the light, fruity taste of olive oil must have seemed very strange indeed. It was primarily used in wealthy households during Lent, when animal fats were forbidden, and was so expensive that it was measured out drop by drop like medicine. The story of sugar deserves special attention here, as it represents one of the most dramatic transformations in Tudor dining. Sugar from Cyprus was so valuable that it was kept in locked boxes and measured out with the same care used for precious metals. Before sugar became available, English sweetening relied on honey, which had a very different flavor profile and couldn't be used in the same ways. Picture yourself in a Tudor kitchen watching a cook work with this precious substance. Sugar arrived in large, cone-shaped loaves that were incredibly harder than modern brown sugar. Special tools were needed to chip pieces off these cones, and then more work was required to grind the chunks into usable powder. The transformation of these rock-hard sugar cones into delicate, sweet confections required considerable skill and physical effort. The applications for sugar went far beyond simple sweetening. It could be boiled into syrups of different consistencies, from light glazes to hard candy. It could be mixed with almonds to create marchpane, or combined with egg whites to make royal icing-like coatings for special occasions. Most remarkably, sugar could be pulled and shaped while hot to create decorative elements that were purely ornamental. Edible sculptures that existed solely to demonstrate the host's wealth and the cook's artistry. But perhaps the most sophisticated use of these imported ingredients was in the creation of complex, multi-layered flavor combinations that showcased a cook's skill and the household's access to international trade networks. Picture a dish that might have been served at a grand Tudor feast: roasted venison glazed with honey and cinnamon, garnished with sugared almonds, and served with a sauce made from wine, verjuice, and exotic spices. Every element of this dish would have told a story of global trade connections: the cinnamon from Ceylon, the almonds from Spain, the sugar from Cyprus, the wine from France, The preparation of such dishes required not just expensive ingredients, but also considerable knowledge and skill. Cooks had to understand how different spices worked together, which combinations were harmonious and which would clash. They needed to know how to balance sweet and sour, how to use spices medicinally as well as culinarily, and how to create presentations that would impress sophisticated diners who had traveled widely and experienced many different cuisines. Let's pause for a moment to consider the broader implications of this spice trade. Every pinch of black pepper on a Tudor table represented a complex network of relationships, merchants in England with connections to traders in Venice, who worked with suppliers in Constantinople, who dealt with spice growers in distant tropical islands. The cost of these spices wasn't just about their intrinsic value, but also reflected the enormous risks and expenses involved in moving them across thousands of miles of often dangerous territory. Pirates, storms, political upheavals, and simple navigational errors could all affect the spice trade, creating shortages that drove prices even higher. Picture a Tudor steward anxiously waiting for news of a spice shipment, knowing that the household's reputation for sophisticated entertaining depended on having access to the best and most exotic seasonings when ships arrived safely with their precious cargoes. It was cause for genuine celebration. The social implications of spice use were just as important as the culinary ones. A dish heavily seasoned with expensive spices was making a statement about the host's wealth, sophistication, and international connections. Guests could literally taste the money that had been spent on their entertainment, and the more exotic the seasonings, the more honored they should feel. This led to some interesting culinary developments that might seem odd to modern palates. Tudor cooks often combined flavors that we would consider incompatible, mixing cinnamon with meat dishes, adding pepper to sweet preparations, or seasoning fish with exotic spices that completely masked their natural flavors. The goal wasn't necessarily what we would consider good taste, but rather a demonstration of the cook's access to expensive ingredients and willingness to use them lavishly. Consider, for example, a typical Tudor preparation called SOPs in wine, basically bread soaked in spiced wine and then topped with additional seasonings. The bread might be ordinary, but the wine would be imported from France or Spain, and the spices could include saffron worth more than gold, long pepper from India, and grains of paradise from West Africa. This simple dish became a showcase for the most expensive ingredients available, transforming humble bread into something that proclaimed the host's wealth and sophistication. The preservation aspects of spice use were also crucial in an age before refrigeration. Salt was the primary preservative, but many spices had antimicrobial properties that helped keep food safe longer. Cloves, cinnamon, and nutmeg all had preservative qualities, while their strong flavors could mask the taste of meat that was perhaps not quite as fresh as we would prefer today. Picture a Tudor cook carefully selecting spices, not just for their flavor, but for their ability to extend the usable life of expensive ingredients. As our exploration of spiced imports and Mediterranean treasures comes to a close, let your mind rest on the image of a Tudor spice merchant's shop at the end of a busy day. The wooden drawers are closed and locked, their precious contents safely secured until morning. The scales have been cleaned and put away, and the ledger book's record Another day of trading in treasures from around the world. The lingering aromas of cinnamon, nutmeg, and pepper seem to tell stories of distant lands and dangerous voyages, of wealth and luxury beyond the imagination of ordinary people tomorrow. These spices will transform simple ingredients into complex, sophisticated dishes that will delight and impress the wealthy diners lucky enough to afford them. But tonight, in the quiet shop filled with the ghosts of exotic fragrances, there's a sense of wonder at the human ingenuity that could bring the flavors of the entire world to a single English table, one small, precious spice at a time. Now, as your muscles relax completely and your breathing becomes ever deeper and more peaceful, let me take you behind the scenes of what might be the most remarkable food production operation in all of Tudor England. Picture yourself invisible and weightless, drifting through the labyrinthine kitchens of Hampton Court Palace, where 200 kitchen staff members work together in perfect coordination to feed 600 hungry courtiers every single day. The scale of this operation would challenge even modern industrial kitchens. But somehow, using only wood fires, hand tools, and centuries of accumulated wisdom, these Tudor cooks managed to create culinary magic on an almost unimaginable scale. Begin by visualizing the sheer size of this kitchen complex, but rather 55 different chambers, each dedicated to a specific aspect of food preparation. There's the great kitchen with its 6 enormous fireplaces, the boiling house for preparing broths and stews, the pastry rooms where delicate confections take shape, and specialized storage areas designed to keep different types of food at optimal temperatures. The sound that emerges from this complex is like a symphony, the crackling of fires, the bubbling of cauldrons, the rhythmic chopping of vegetables, and the constant murmur of coordination between dozens of workers. Let's start our exploration at the very beginning of the process, where raw ingredients arrive at the palace. Picture the tradesman's entrance, a dedicated gateway where everything passes under an archway into a cobbled courtyard. Here, every single item is unloaded and examined with the kind of attention usually reserved for precious gems. Teams of accountants, called the clerks of the green cloth, keep meticulous records, ensuring that nothing disappears and that costs remain under control. Can you imagine the pressure on these men? They're responsible for tracking thousands of pounds worth of food moving through the palace every week, and any mistakes could mean their jobs, or worse. The quantities involved are almost beyond comprehension. Historical records suggest that Hampton Court consumed over 14,000 large animals annually, along with enormous quantities of fish, fowl, and game. Picture cartload after barrels of fish, sacks of grain, wheels of cheese, and barrels of ale and wine. The courtyard would have been a constant bustle of activity, with carters unloading their precious cargo, while clerks scurried about with their ledger books, making careful notes of every item's quality, quantity, and price. From this central courtyard, an army of kitchen porters would carry supplies to their appropriate destinations throughout the complex. Picture these men, strong and experienced, knowing exactly where each type of ingredient needed to go. Narrow fish corda, cleverly designed refrigeration system that stayed naturally cold because it ran north to south, keeping the sun from shining directly in. The open-air design allowed for circulation, while the stone walls provided insulation. creating what was essentially a medieval walk-in cooler. Let me guide you now into the boiling house, one of the most specialized rooms in the entire complex. Here, massive copper cauldrons bubbled constantly over carefully maintained fires. This wasn't just about making soup though. Plenty of that was prepared here too. The primary purpose was to partially cook large joints of meat, reducing the time they would need to spend on the roasting spits. Picture an enormous leg of beef being lowered into one of these cauldrons, where it would simmer gently until partially cooked. Raw meat could take many hours to cook through completely on a spit, requiring constant attention from the spit boys and consuming enormous amounts of precious firewood. By partially cooking large pieces in the boiling house first, the kitchen staff could reduce roasting time significantly while ensuring that even the largest joints would be cooked evenly throughout. The broths left behind in the cauldrons weren't wasted. They became the base for pottages and sauces that would accompany the finished roasts. The great kitchen itself was a marvel of medieval engineering and organization. Picture 6 enormous fireplaces, each large enough to roast an entire ox, burning constantly throughout the day. The heat in this room must have been almost unbearable, especially during summer months, with temperatures that would challenge even the hardiest kitchen workers. Yet somehow, teams of spitboys managed to tend these fires hour after hour, turning massive joints of meat with mechanical precision. The spitboys were among the lowest-ranking members of the kitchen staff, but their job was crucial to the success of every meal. Picture a young boy, perhaps 10 or 12 years old, standing next to a fire that throws off waves of scorching heat, turning a heavy iron spit loaded with meat. He can't let his attention wander for even a moment to slow, and the meat burns. On one side, too fast, and it doesn't cook evenly. This work continued for hours at a time. Craftsmen. The coordination required to manage all these fires simultaneously was extraordinary. Each fireplace operated on its own schedule, with different cuts of meat requiring different cooking times and techniques. The head cook had to keep track of dozens of separate cooking processes, knowing exactly when each piece would be done, and ensuring that everything finished at the right time for service. Picture him moving through the kitchen like a conductor leading an orchestra, checking the progress of roasts, adjusting fires, and coordinating with his team to ensure perfect timing. But the great kitchen was just one part of this culinary symphony. These rooms were kept deliberately cooler than the main kitchens, creating better conditions for working with sugar and delicate doughs. Picture skilled hands rolling wafer-thin pastry, carefully molding marchpane into elaborate subtleties, and monitoring the precise temperature of sugar syrups as they cooked to different stages of hardness. The coordination between all these different areas required a level of organization that would impress modern restaurant managers. Picture messengers constantly moving between rooms, carrying updates on timing and progress. The head cook might send word to the pastry department that the main course would be delayed by half an hour, allowing the confectioners to adjust their timing accordingly. Meanwhile, servants in the great hall would need to be informed so they could manage the expectations of hungry diners. Storage and preservation were constant challenges in this pre-refrigeration world. The fish court was just one example of Tudor ingenuity in keeping food fresh. Other storage areas were designed with specific purposes in mind: dry storage for grains and spices, cool cellars for wine and ale, and specialized rooms for aging cheeses and cured meats. Picture teams of storage specialists, each expert in maintaining their particular type of provision, checking daily for signs of spoilage and rotating stock to ensure that the oldest items were used first. The scale of meal service at Hampton Court was staggering. Up to 14 courses might be served at a formal dinner, with each course consisting of multiple dishes. Picture the logistics of getting hundreds of plates of hot food from the kitchens to the dining halls simultaneously. Teams of servers would form assembly lines, carrying dishes through corridors and upstairs, all while maintaining the precise timing required to ensure that food arrived at the table at optimal temperature. The serving process itself was a carefully choreographed performance, allocating dishes according to the strict social hierarchy that governed every aspect of court life. Higher-ranking diners received more varied and expensive dishes, while those of lower status made do with simpler fare. Tudor feast preparation was the sheer creativity and artistry involved in creating memorable dining experiences. Picture the planning sessions where master cooks would design elaborate subtleties, coordinate the presentation of multiple courses. In an age before global shipping and greenhouse production, cooks had to work with whatever ingredients were available locally and seasonally. This required not just cooking skills, but also extensive knowledge of preservation techniques, seasonal timing, and alternative ingredients. Picture a head cook in late winter, carefully managing dwindling stores of preserved foods while planning menus that would carry the household through to the first fresh ingredients of spring. The preparation of special occasion feasts pushed these challenges to their absolute limits. Christmas dinners, wedding celebrations, and diplomatic banquets required months of planning and preparation. Picture the detailed lists and schedules that must have been created for such events: which spices to order and when, which meats to buy and how to store them, which servants to assign to which tasks, and how to coordinate everything so that hundreds of dishes would be ready at precisely the right moment. The knowledge required to manage such an operation was extraordinary. Master cooks needed to understand not just cooking techniques, but also supply chain management, staff coordination, food safety, seasonal availability, and the complex social hierarchies that governed who could eat what and when. This knowledge was passed down through generations of kitchen workers, each learning from their predecessors and adding their own innovations to the collective wisdom. The tools and equipment used in these kitchens were marvels of medieval technology. Picture enormous copper cauldrons that could hold dozens of gallons, iron spits strong enough to support whole oxen, and specialized utensils designed for specific tasks. The maintenance of this equipment was a constant concern. Broken spits or leaking cauldrons could disrupt meal service for hundreds of people. Fire management was, perhaps, the most critical skill in the entire operation. Picture master fire tenders who understood exactly how to build and maintain fires of different intensities for different purposes. A gentle fire for slow cooking stews, a roaring blaze for searing roasts, a steady, moderate heat for baking bread. Each required different techniques and constant attention. The amount of fuel consumed by these kitchens was enormous. requiring a constant supply of wood and charcoal that had to be carefully managed to avoid running short at crucial moments. The waste management challenges were equally significant. Picture the enormous quantities of bones, scraps, and other waste generated by preparing food for 600 people daily. Nothing was simply thrown away. Bones were boiled for stock. Scraps were fed to animals or composted, and even ash from the fires was saved for making soap and other household products. This wasn't just about economy in an age when everything had value. Waste was considered both sinful and impractical. As we near the end of our exploration of Tudor feast preparation, let your mind rest on the image of these kitchens at the end of a successful feast day. The fires are burning low, the last dishes have been served and cleared, and the kitchen staff are finally able to sit down to their own meal. Simpler fare, perhaps, but satisfying after a day of creating culinary magic for their betters. There's a sense of pride in work well done, of challenges overcome through skill and coordination. The accomplishment represented by these daily feasts was extraordinary, turning raw ingredients into elaborate multi-course meals that satisfied both hunger and the social requirements of one of Europe's most sophisticated courts. Every successful service represented the culmination of centuries of accumulated knowledge, passed down through generations of cooks who understood that feeding people was about much more than simple sustenance. It was about creating experiences, demonstrating values, and bringing people together in the most fundamental way possible through the sharing of food prepared with skill, care, and artistry that transformed necessity into wonder. As you sink deeper into that comfortable, drowsy state, where every meal was a carefully orchestrated performance of social hierarchy, religious observance, and cultural sophistication, picture yourself as an invisible observer floating above the great hall of a noble household, watching as dozens of people take their places for the main meal of the day. The scene below you unfolds like a complex dance. Every choice of seat carries profound social meaning. The first thing that would strike you about Tudor dining is how completely different it was from our modern notion of individual meals. This was communal eating in the truest sense, not just people sharing a table, but literally sharing their food from common dishes. Picture the careful arrangement of the hall, the highest-ranking diners seated at a table raised on a dais, looking out over the rest of the company, while other tables are arranged at right angles in strict order of precedence. Every single placement has been calculated to reflect the exact social standing of each diner. Let your mind focus now on the furniture and table settings, so different from what we're accustomed to today. The tables themselves are not permanent fixtures, but rather boards laid across trestle supports that can be dismantled and stored when not in use. This practical arrangement allows the great hall to serve multiple purposes throughout the day: dining room at mealtimes, meeting place for household business, and entertainment space for evening diversions. Picture the servants setting up these tables each morning and breaking them down each evening, a daily ritual that marks the rhythm of household life. The seating arrangements tell a fascinating story of Tudor social dynamics. Only the highest-ranking person at each table, perhaps the lord of the manor or the most important guest, is granted the privilege of a chair with a back. Everyone else, regardless of their status in the outside world, sits on simple benches. Imagine the careful negotiations that must have taken place when multiple nobles of similar rank dined together. Who sits closest to the head of table? Who gets the single chair? These questions might seem trivial to us, but in Tudor society, they could affect political alliances and social standing for years to come. Now, let me guide your attention to the place settings, which would look quite foreign to modern eyes. Each diner has a trench or a shallow wooden bowl or plate, though wealthy households might use silver or even gold for their most important guests. There's a cup for drinking, and here's where things get interesting. Each person brings their own knife and spoon. Forks are virtually unknown, except for the single fork reserved for the king himself when he eats sweet preserves. Everyone else uses their fingers, their knife, and their spoon to navigate their meal. Picture yourself watching diners prepare for the meal. Each person washes their hands carefully before sitting down, not just a quick rinse, but a thorough cleansing with soap and warm water brought by servants. A linen napkin is hung over the left shoulder, ready to clean fingers between dishes. These preparations aren't just about cleanliness, they're rituals that mark the transition from ordinary time to the sacred act of communal dining, the most revolutionary aspect of Tudor dining. From our perspective, is the concept of messes shared, portions of food that would be divided between diners. At the high table, 2 people share each mess, while at lower tables, 4 people might share the same portion. Imagine the social dynamics this created. You're not just eating your own food, but negotiating the sharing of each dish with your table mates. Etiquette demanded that you take only your fair share, that you not touch food with unwashed hands, and that you never put anything back into a shared dish once it had touched your mouth. Let me walk you through the elaborate etiquette rules that governed this sharing. When soft foods, like pottages or stews, were served, each diner would use their spoon to take a portion onto their own trencher, being careful to wipe the spoon clean with bread before the next person used it. For meat dishes, the process was more complex. You would grasp the piece you wanted with the thumb and 2 fingers of your left hand, then use your knife to cut off your portion. The meat would then be eaten with your fingers, while your knife was carefully cleaned between uses. Picture the concentration required to navigate a meal under these conditions. Modern diners can focus entirely on conversation and enjoyment, but Tudor diners had to constantly monitor their behavior to avoid social disasters. Don't stuff your mouth. Don't pick your teeth. Don't make rude noises. Don't scratch yourself. Don't blow on your food. Don't spit in the washing basin or across the table. The list of prohibited behaviors was extensive and had to be memorized by anyone who hoped to dine in polite society. The timing and structure of Tudor meals created their own rhythm and social dynamics. Dinner was typically served at 10 or 11 in the morning during the early Tudor period, though by the later 16th century it had moved to around noon. This main meal of the day could easily last 2 hours in wealthy households, with multiple courses and elaborate presentations designed to entertain as well as nourish the diners. Picture the procession of courses. First, the boiled meats and pottages, followed by roasted and baked dishes, and finally the sweet course with its hypocras, wafers, and elaborate subtleties. Each course arrival was announced with ceremony, and diners were expected to admire not just the taste, but also the presentation of each dish. The time between courses allowed for conversation, entertainment, and the social bonding that was one of the primary purposes of communal dining. But not everyone ate at the same time. In large households, meals were served in relays first, the master and his guests, then the senior servants, then the junior household staff. Each group ate the leftovers from the previous group, with the final remains often distributed to the poor at the gate. This system ensured that food wasn't wasted while maintaining strict social hierarchies, even in the most basic act of eating. The court dining customs at places like Hampton Court Palace elevated these basic principles to extraordinary levels of complexity and ceremony. Picture 400 courtiers entitled to 2 meals daily, served at precisely 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. The seating arrangements alone required careful planning. Here ranking courtiers in the great watching chamber, lesser ranks in the great hall, with every placement calculated to reflect the complex hierarchies of court life. The king himself, when dining formally, sat alone at a high table under a canopy of state in his presence chamber. Picture this scene: the most powerful man in England, eating by himself, while courtiers watch from a respectful distance. Even at this solitary meal, every gesture was carefully observed and analyzed for political meaning. What dishes did he favor? How much did he eat? Tudor dining added another layer of complexity to every meal. Fish days and meat days were carefully observed. Picture the household steward consulting religious calendars to plan menus, ensuring that the proper foods were served on the proper days, while still maintaining the level of luxury expected by noble guests. The entertainment aspects of Tudor dining were as important as the food itself. Picture musicians playing softly in the gallery above the great hall, their melodies providing a sophisticated backdrop to conversation and dining. Sometimes there might be more elaborate entertainments, jesters, or even theatrical performances staged between courses. The goal was to create an experience that engaged all the senses and created lasting memories for guests. The serving staff played crucial roles in these elaborate productions. Picture dozens of servants moving through the hall with practiced precision, carrying dishes, refilling cups, and managing the complex logistics of feeding hundreds of people simultaneously. Their training was extensive. They needed to understand not just the mechanics of service, but also the social hierarchies that determined who was served first, who received the best portions, and how to handle the inevitable complications that arose when protocol met practical necessity. The cleanup after these elaborate meals was almost as complex as the service itself. Picture servants clearing dozens of trenchers, washing hundreds of spoons and knives, and managing the enormous quantities of leftover food that remained after each meal. Nothing was wasted. Leftovers were redistributed to servants, then to the poor, with bones saved for making broth and scraps fed to animals. Even the used trenchers made from bread were saved and distributed as food for the hungry. The seasonal variations in dining customs reflected the agricultural rhythms that still governed Tudor life. Picture the dramatic differences between winter meals, heavy with preserved meats and root vegetables, and summer feasts featuring fresh fruits, tender young vegetables, and recently caught fish. The planning required to maintain appropriate variety throughout the year was enormous, requiring extensive knowledge of preservation techniques and seasonal availability. The costs associated with maintaining these elaborate dining customs were staggering. Picture household stewards carefully managing budgets that allocated enormous sums to food and service, sometimes up to 10% of a nobleman's entire annual income might be spent on feeding his immediate family. These expenses were considered essential investments in social standing and political influence. The training required to navigate Tudor dining customs properly began in childhood for members of the nobility. Picture young pages and maids learning the intricate rules of precedence, the proper ways to share food, and the countless small details that distinguished a well-bred person from a social climber. These skills were considered as important as reading and writing, perhaps more important, since dining skills were used daily while literacy was less universally necessary. The diplomatic implications of dining customs could affect international relations. Picture the careful planning required when foreign ambassadors visited, which customs to follow, how to honor guests without compromising local traditions. Of food service, a successful diplomatic dinner could strengthen alliances and facilitate negotiations, while cultural missteps could damage relationships for years. As we conclude our exploration of Tudor dining customs and court etiquette, let your mind rest on the image of a great hall after a successful feast. The tables have been cleared and dismantled, the servants have finished their cleanup, and the space has returned to its multiple uses. But the memories of the meal linger, the conversations shared over common dishes, the demonstrations of wealth and sophistication, the reinforcement of social bonds through the ancient ritual of breaking bread together. The complexity and beauty of Tudor dining customs remind us that eating has always been about much more than simple nutrition. These elaborate rituals served to bind communities together, to demonstrate and maintain social order, and to transform the basic necessity of food into an art form that engaged all the senses and created lasting memories. A small theatrical production, every dinner a reaffirmation of the values and hierarchies that held Tudor society together, one carefully orchestrated bite at a time. And now, as you drift into that perfect state between waking and sleeping, let me guide you through the final chapter of our Tudor culinary journey into the cyclical world of seasonal eating and the ingenious preservation techniques that allowed English nobility to feast year-round. Picture yourself suspended in time, watching the great wheel of the agricultural year turn slowly around you, each season bringing its own treasures and challenges to the Tudor table. Let's begin in the hopeful days of early spring, when the long deprivations of winter finally start to ease. Picture a Tudor kitchen garden awakening from its dormancy, with the first tender shoots of leeks and onions pushing through the cold soil. The cook might venture out in the early morning, when the dew still clings to everything, searching for the first wild herbs that will add fresh flavors to a diet grown monotonous after months of preserved foods. Nettle tops, dandelion greens, and wild garlic would be gathered with careful hands, their bitter green vitality a welcome change from the heavy, salted flavors that had dominated the winter months. But spring was still a precarious time, when preserved foods from the previous year were running low, but fresh alternatives remained scarce. Picture the household steward carefully managing dwindling stores, calculating how long the remaining salt pork and dried beans would last before the first substantial harvests arrived. This period known as the Hunger Gap, tested the preservation skills and forward planning of even the wealthiest households. The arrival of early summer brought the first real abundance since the previous autumn. Picture July, when people in Tudor England picked fresh strawberries, cherries, plums, and gooseberries. Imagine walking through an orchard heavy with fruit, the air sweet with the scent of ripening cherries and the buzz of bees working among the blossoms. These fresh fruits were precious not just for their taste, but for their rarity. They would be available for only a few short weeks before the season moved on. The preservation of summer. Fruits required immediate action and considerable skill. Picture kitchen maids working frantically to process bushels of strawberries before they spoiled, some being preserved in honey, others dried in the sun, and the finest specimens saved fresh for immediate consumption by the lord and his family. Cherries would be packed in barrels with salt and vinegar, creating a sweet-sour preserve that could last through the winter months. But it was the great harvest season of autumn that truly tested the preservation skills of Tudor households. Picture the organized chaos of harvest time, when every available hand was pressed into service to gather, process, and store the year's bounty before winter's grip could destroy it. The timing was critical. Too early, and fruits wouldn't be fully ripe. Too late, and frost might ruin everything. Experienced housekeepers developed an almost mystical sense of timing, reading the subtle signs of weather and plant maturity to determine the perfect moment for each harvest. Salt was by far the most necessary ingredient to Tudor peasants, as it was the most reliable way to keep food from spoiling long-term. Picture the careful process of salting down massive quantities of pork and beef, each piece cut to precise sizes, rubbed thoroughly with coarse salt, and layered in wooden barrels with additional salt between each layer. The salt drew moisture from the meat, creating an environment hostile to the bacteria that caused spoilage. This process required considerable skill and experience to get right. To little salt, and the meat would rot. Too much, and it would become inedibly salty. The slaughter that preceded this preservation work was both practical necessity and community celebration. Picture the bloody slaughter that marked the approach of winter, when livestock that couldn't be fed through the cold months had to be processed quickly. This wasn't the grim business it might sound like. It was often accompanied by feasting, as people ate the fresh meat that couldn't be preserved, creating one last celebration of abundance before winter's austerity set in. The smoking of meats added another layer of preservation, while creating distinctive flavors that Tudor diners particularly prized. Picture enormous smoking chambers built specially for this purpose, where sides of bacon and whole hams hung in fragrant clouds of oak and apple wood smoke. The process could take weeks, with fires tended carefully to maintain the right temperature and smoke density. The resulting meats would keep for months, their surfaces darkened and hardened by the smoking process, but their interiors remaining tender and flavorful. But preservation wasn't just about meat. Vegetables required their own specialized techniques. Picture root cellars carved deep into the earth, where turnips, carrots, and onions could be stored in cool, humid conditions that prevented both drying and freezing. Apples, quinces, and pears were stewed and preserved, baked in pastry, or thickened with oats or breadcrumbs to make a sort of pottage. The techniques for preserving each type of vegetable had to be learned through experience. Some needed to be kept dry, others slightly moist. Some required protection from light, while others needed air circulation. Pickling in vinegar offered another preservation method that added tangy flavors to the Tudor diet. Picture enormous earthenware crocks filled with vegetables submerged in seasoned vinegar. The acidic environment preventing spoilage while creating complex, sour flavors that helped combat the monotony of preserved foods. Cabbage would be pickled whole or chopped onions preserved in spiced vinegar, and even fruits like pears and apples given the pickling treatment to extend their usable life. The making of conserves and preserves allowed wealthy households to capture the essence of summer fruits for winter consumption. Picture skilled confectioners working with precious sugar to create fruit preserves that were both delicious and stable. The high sugar content preventing bacterial growth while preserving the fruit's flavor and nutritional value. These preserves were often more valuable than the fresh fruit itself, representing not just the cost of the fruit, but also the expensive sugar required to preserve it. Drying was perhaps the oldest preservation technique, and Tudor cooks had refined it to a high art. Picture special drying chambers where herbs, fruits, and even some vegetables were carefully arranged on racks and allowed to dehydrate slowly in controlled conditions. Properly dried foods could last for years if stored correctly, making this technique essential for long-term food security. The knowledge of which foods could be successfully dried and how to do it properly was passed down through generations of experienced cooks. The preservation of dairy products required its own specialized knowledge and equipment. Picture the cool, stone-lined dairy, where butter was carefully salted and packed into special pots that excluded air, preventing rancidity for months. Cheesemaking was an even more complex art, requiring precise timing, temperature control, and an understanding of the bacterial processes that transformed milk into a product that could last through the winter months. The storage facilities required for all these preserved foods were substantial investments in themselves. Picture vast cellars and storerooms, each designed for specific types of provisions. Dry goods needed protection from moisture and rodents, while wet preserves required cool, stable temperatures. The organization of these storage areas was crucial. Everything had to be labeled and tracked so that older items were used first and nothing was forgotten until it spoiled. The seasonal rhythms of preservation work created their own social patterns within Tudor households. Picture the communal effort required during harvest and preservation season, when normal household routines were suspended and everyone contributed to the massive task of preparing for winter. These periods of intense work were also times of community bonding, as people worked together toward the common goal of surviving the cold months ahead. But preservation wasn't just about survival. It was also about maintaining the sophisticated dining standards expected in noble households throughout the year. Picture a December feast where the table groaned under dishes made from foods preserved months earlier, ham that had been carefully smoked in autumn, fruit preserves that captured the essence of summer, pickled vegetables that provided essential nutrition during the lean months. The skill required to transform preserved ingredients into appetizing dishes was considerable, requiring creativity and expertise to mask the sometimes harsh flavors of heavily salted or dried foods. The trade in preserved foods created its own economic networks throughout Tudor England. Picture merchants specializing in specific types of preserved good salt fish from coastal areas, dried fruits from southern regions, preserved meats from areas with good hunting and grazing. Wealthy households might purchase exotic preserved foods from distant regions, adding variety to their winter diets and demonstrating their affluence and sophistication. The health implications of seasonal eating and preservation were well understood by Tudor physicians and housekeepers. Picture learned discussions about the humoral properties of different preserved foods. Ones were considered heating or cooling, moistening or drying. The goal was to maintain bodily health throughout the year by balancing preserved foods with whatever fresh ingredients remained available, creating diets that supported both physical and mental well-being during the challenging winter months. The timing of preservation work required careful coordination with other household activities. Picture the complex scheduling required to manage harvest, preservation, and normal daily operations simultaneously. Fields had to be harvested when crops were ready, but preservation work couldn't be delayed without risking spoilage. The household steward had to coordinate dozens of workers, ensure adequate supplies of salt and other preserving materials, and manage the logistics of processing enormous quantities of food in a relatively short time. The knowledge required for successful preservation was vast and specialized. Picture experienced housekeepers who could judge the quality of salt by its color and texture, who knew exactly how long to smoke different cuts of meat, who could predict which apples would store well and which should be processed immediately. This knowledge was accumulated over decades of experience and passed down through generations of household staff, creating an invaluable repository of practical wisdom. The equipment used for preservation was substantial and expensive. Picture specialized barrels for different types of preserved foods, smoking chambers built to exact specifications, stone crocks designed for pickling, and the countless smaller tools needed for chopping, slicing, and preparing foods for preservation. The initial investment in this equipment was considerable, but it was essential for any household that hoped to maintain food security throughout the year. The seasonal variations in diet created their own pleasures and anticipations. Picture the excitement that greeted the first fresh foods of spring after months of preserved provisions, or the satisfaction of autumn preservation work well done. Each season brought its own flavors and textures, creating a natural rhythm of dietary variation that modern eaters, with our year-round access to global foods, can barely imagine. As our exploration of seasonal harvests and preservation arts draws to a close, let your mind rest on the image of a Tudor storage chamber. In deep winter, the shelves are lined with barrels, crocks, and sacks containing the preserved bounty of the previous year's harvest. Each container represents foresight, skill, and hard work, the accumulated wisdom of generations who understood that survival and prosperity depended on the ability to capture abundance and make it last through times of scarcity. The preservation arts of Tudor England remind us that food security has always required planning, skill, and community cooperation. These techniques weren't just practical necessities, but also expressions of cultural values, the importance of self-reliance, the wisdom of preparation, and the understanding that true wealth lies not just in current abundance, but in the ability to maintain that abundance through changing seasons and circumstances. Every preserved apple, every barrel of salt pork, every crock of pickled vegetables represented a victory over time and uncertainty, one carefully prepared bite at a time. And so, dear friends, as our gentle journey through the fascinating world of Tudor dining comes to its peaceful conclusion, may these memories of ancient kitchens and elaborate feasts guide you into the most restful of dreams. We've wandered together through gardens of marchpane subtleties, marveled at exotic meats served in their own golden plumage, tasted the precious spices that connected English tables to the wider world, explored the remarkable kitchens where culinary magic happened daily, observed the intricate social dances of communal dining, and discovered the ingenious ways our ancestors captured summer's bounty for winter's sustenance. If you found yourself drifting peacefully as we explored these forgotten worlds of flavor and tradition, let me know in the comments below. Sweet dreams to you all. And now, as the soft sounds of our Tudor kitchens fade into the gentle rhythm of your breathing, rest well knowing that the simple act of sharing food has always been one of humanity's most beautiful and enduring traditions. And may your dreams be filled with the warm glow of ancient hearths and the timeless pleasure of meals shared with those we hold dear.